In 1991, two hikers in the Alps stumbled upon a body melting out of a glacier. At over 10,000 feet, they figured they'd found the victim of a modern mountaineering accident. The body was leathery, contorted, and grim. But when authorities finally pulled the corpse from the ice, they realized this was no recent tragedy. The man they were looking at was over 5,000 years old, and he hadn't just frozen to death, he'd been murdered. This is the story of Ötzi the Iceman, the victim of what may be the oldest unsolved criminal case on Earth. And even now, over 3 decades later, scientists are still uncovering what happened to him. September 19th, 1991. German hikers Helmut and Erika Siemann are making their way across the Tisenjoch Pass in the Ötztal Alps, right on the border between Austria and Italy. There, lying face down in a gully of meltwater, a human body. They reported it, assuming it was an unlucky mountaineer. The recovery that followed was a disaster. The weather was terrible, there was no archaeologist on site, and the body was damaged as it was hacked out of the ice with ski poles and an ice pick. It was brought to the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Innsbruck, Austria. That's where archaeologist Konrad Spindler was finally called in. He took one look at an axe found with the body, an axe made of copper, and went pale. This person wasn't a few years old. He was at least 4,000 years old. Radiocarbon dating later proved he was even older, living somewhere between 3,350 and 3,105 BC. Europe's oldest known natural human mummy had just been found. They nicknamed him Ötzi for the Ötztal Valley where he was discovered. Nobody was treating it like a crime scene, not yet. So who was this man? What can a 5,300-year-old body actually tell us? Turns out, almost everything. The glacier had acted as a perfect time capsule. Ötzi was about 45 years old, stood around 5'3" and lean. But forget those early reconstructions of a shaggy, pale-skinned caveman. A 2023 genetic study showed a very different picture. Dark skin, brown eyes, and a genetic disposition for male pattern baldness. He looked nothing like we imagined. He was no helpless wanderer either. He carried a flint dagger, a quiver with 14 arrows, and the unfinished stave of a yew longbow taller than he was. But his most prized possession was a copper axe. 99.7% pure copper, with its handle and bindings still completely intact. It's the only prehistoric copper axe in the world that has survived like that. Owning something like this in the Copper Age would have been like carrying a weapon nobody else had access to. An object that rare tells us something. This man had status. And that status may have gotten him killed. For a full decade, the world assumed Ötzi had simply gotten caught in a blizzard and frozen to death. A tragic accident. Case closed. Then, in 2001, 10 years after his discovery, a new set of x-rays changed everything. Buried deep in his left shoulder was a flint arrowhead. Ötzi didn't freeze to death. Someone killed him. The arrow had been shot from behind. It punched through his back, fractured his shoulder blade, and the stone tip lodged deep in his shoulder. Someone, either Ötzi himself or his attacker, pulled the arrow shaft out, but the stone tip stayed inside. For 10 years, nobody had even noticed. Now the question shifted. If this was murder, what happened in the days and hours leading up to his death? By analyzing pollen and moss preserved in his gut and on his clothes, researchers traced his final movements. The pollen showed he'd been up in the high mountains, then descended into a lower valley, before making one last brutal climb toward the high pass where his body would eventually be found. It seems as if Ötzi was a man on the run, and there were clear signs of a fight, not just at the end, but in the days before. His right hand had a deep defensive cut between his thumb and forefinger. He had grabbed someone's blade. The wound was days old by the time he died, and when his body was found, that hand was in an unusual position. A recent study suggests it was bandaged, possibly with moss found at the site, a material known in the ancient world for treating wounds. Even before the final attack, Ötzi was patching himself up. DNA analysis found traces of blood from at least 4 other people on his knife, on his arrows, on his clothes. Whatever happened in those final days, it involved more than one confrontation. Ötzi wasn't going down quietly. His stomach contents told their own story. His last meal, eaten just an hour or two before his death, was a heavy portion of dried ibex meat and einkorn wheat. His stomach also contained toxic bracken fern. Some researchers believe he was self-medicating against the intestinal parasites that plagued him. Even wounded, he stopped for a big meal before his final ascent. A man fueling up, not giving up. Then, the killer caught up. From an estimated 30 meters away, an arrow hit him in the back. No warning, no face-to-face confrontation. It was an ambush. For decades, that's where the story ended. Shot from behind, bled out in minutes. But in late 2025, a team of surgeons did something no one had done before. They reconstructed the wound using modern trauma medicine. The arrowhead had come to rest just a centimeter from the major artery that feeds the arm, but it hadn't severed it. The wound track ran mostly through muscle tissue, and the muscle closed around it like a natural seal. The bleeding was internal and limited, in medical terms, roughly equivalent to a blood donation. Serious, but not immediately fatal. Ötzi didn't die in minutes. He may have survived for hours, wounded and losing strength, at over 3,000 meters in thin air, with a stone arrowhead buried in his back. He kept moving. The place where his body was found may not have been the place where he was shot, but the arrow wasn't the only story written on Ötzi's body. Across Ötzi's skin, researchers counted 61 tattoos. Not decorative images, simple lines and crosses made by rubbing charcoal into small cuts. When they mapped the locations, something unexpected turned up. The tattoos were clustered on his lower back, knees, and ankles, exactly the areas where his skeleton showed severe joint degeneration. A large number of these marks line up with points that would later be identified by classical acupuncture for treating joint pain. His culture may have practiced a form of therapeutic medicine thousands of years before the practice is thought to have emerged in Asia. He even carried medicinal fungi with known antibiotic properties. Ötzi's skin reads like a medical record from a world we thought we understood. Ötzi's killer vanished 5,300 years ago, but history is full of cases like this. Murders, disappearances, and mysteries that were buried for centuries. If you want to see what else we dig up, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. Today, Ötzi the Iceman rests in a custom-built cold cell in Bolzano, Italy. Over 3 decades after his discovery, new studies are still rewriting what we thought we knew. We know what he wore, what he ate, the diseases he carried, and the weapons he fought with. We know he was in violent conflict in his final days, that he treated his own wounds, and that he was shot in the back by someone he never saw. And we now know he didn't die quickly. He fought to survive, walking wounded through the mountains until his body gave out. But after 5,300 years, the oldest cold case on Earth is still unsolved. We have the victim, we have the murder weapon, but the killer walked away into the mountains and never looked back.